Ha! Have you ever wanted to paint chrome, but was too intimidated by the subject with all the reflections and lights and everything? Well, worry not, because Papalaboards will give you a super easy recipe. Okay, so first we need to understand a few things about metals and reflections to paint a chrome NMM. I want you to try and not think about chrome as a metal, but as a mirror. A mirror is reflecting everything in its vicinity. Metals can have the same attributes as chrome and reflect as a mirror, but most of the time they are just somewhat shiny and polished, so they reflect some of their surroundings in a more blurred up way. If we want to paint a mirror, we are not really painting the material itself. We paint the image that is reflected by the mirror. So when we paint chrome, we want to paint the reflected images. Now this might sound simple, but the tricky part about it is that our surface that we are painting is not a completely flat surface. Look at this little chrome sphere. This is going to give us a very helpful reference. You can see that the sphere is reflecting the sky and the ground. Around the sides you can see that the horizon is warping in a way that the image follows the shape of the sphere. The horizon is almost black with the trees, and above that we have the sky with a bluish grey color. Right now I'm sketching the sky area with my grey and I'm using a base layer consistency. Cleanliness is very important, so make sure your layers are opaque as possible and there are no translucent layers over the black areas. Go back and forth with grey and black to make these layers nice and clean. As you might guess, the areas that I leave black, those will reflect the ground. So right now we need to have a very clear sketch that which areas reflect the sky and which areas reflect the ground. Now I need to push the contrast towards my black areas. So I reduce the highlight areas inside the French Mirage blue layer directly next to the black layer. This is a back and forth process again, so keep your different colored layers nicely separated. I'm not going to do any extra blending with these parts, since the areas that we work on are quite small and the gray colors are close to each other in a value, so they naturally blend in by putting them next to each other. If you look at the reference, the sky is a little bit higher in value, closer to the trees. We are painting a miniature, so the subtle value change wouldn't be that visible, so we need higher values. Let's talk more about shapes. We looked at the sphere, now let's look at cylinders. I found that nice study where you can see how the mirror effect works on cylinders. Now these are mostly aligned horizontally, but there is a rounded cone shape in the middle that kinda gives away how the mirror effect works on vertically aligned cylinders. These shapes will help you to understand how to sketch the two main areas that are the sky and the ground on a little bit more complex shapes, like the muscles of the legs and arms. The arms are horizontally shaped cylinders that are completely parallel with the ground, so I need to divide the muscles in the middle with a line, and you need to treat each muscle as if they are all separate mirrors. We do not treat them as one surface. We break them down into sections that created by the different muscles. On the face, it's a little bit more difficult since the shape is very complex, but if you break down your main shapes into simple ones, it would be easier. Like the forehead is a cylinder, the cheeks and the chin are distorted spheres, and the jaw is between a cylinder and a cube. One more crucial thing we need to look out for is when to do these separations. We need to check the angle of the surface that we are painting. If the angle faces towards the sky, it would probably reflect the sky. But if the angle facing towards the ground, then it should reflect the ground. So what about the shapes that are a 90-degree angle to the ground and flat? Well, I use a 50-50 rule on them. 50% of the top half will reflect the sky and the other half will reflect the ground. And that's about it. If you follow these rules, you can sketch out the reflections easily. So now I'm pushing the contrast in my recent highlight layer next to the black again. We want to create the gradient over the black parts to make the chrome effect work. It's very important to do it like this, and believe me, this will increase your NMM painting skill too, since you can get away painting random reflections on NMM stuff, and it will still look good. But the more you practice painting mirrors, the more your brain will get used to the process of painting reflections on certain objects and how would those look. Now we are going to paint the base and the main reflections of the base. We need the same color for both. I covered the majority of the rocks with thondia brown, and the parts that we previously painted black, I covered them all as well, leaving a thin black line between the greys and the browns on the chrome parts. Basically, that thin line will create the effect of the far off horizon, so it's an important detail to make the effect work. Opacity is very important again, so make sure you are using base layer consistency. After that, I sketch out the OSL effect that comes from the bottom of the base. I use the airbrush for that, but you can use a regular brush with thin layers to achieve a similar effect. Add more layers to the bottom area and aim your airbrush from below. Don't worry if some of it gets on the character. We need to introduce these blues to the black parts of the left side of the torso, since those parts would reflect this blue light. Add 4 drops of thinner to 1 drop of paint and set your compressor around 5 bar. And make sure you add the thinner first into the airbrush cap. Apply the paint with small bursts for a nice and even coverage. Let's make those blue areas more defined with the brush as well, using base layer consistency. So as I mentioned, some parts of the torso should reflect this blue as well, like the bottom side of the left arm. Remember that metals are more reflective than rocks, so the arms should reflect it more than the surrounding base with the stones. Even though it is further away than the stones with less intensity, we could still use the same level of values that we have on the brightest OSL color. And again, we'd like to keep the thin black line between the grey and blue parts like we did for the brown parts. Reduce the highlight areas on the base with flat earth and make the layers more opaque towards the left side of each rock on the front and the right side on the back, so that will create the illusion of a consistent light source that is coming from the top and a little bit from the left. I'm using base layer consistency, but I add some thinner layers to the darker areas as well. Try to keep the recesses to the thondia brown layer to add more detail and make these rocks more defined. I emphasize on the light source direction by highlighting each side of the cracks from the opposite direction where the light is coming from, so they create the effect that the light is catching these little raised edges. I also reduce the highlight areas in the reflections the same way I did with the grey parts, moving closer to the thin black line with my recent highlight color and leaving some of the previous brown to show through.
Whose sail prevails in the home where laughter mingles, every night tells fairy tales. Papa Lebert's tiny tapping, every heart it sure impales. When the wind outside is howling and the rain taps on the panes, Papa's hands keep up their chordal, blocking out all cares and pains. Tiny slaps a beat like apples, good for heart and good for brains. Every touch a whispered laughter hidden in the sweet refrains.
After that, I add some ice yellow to the flat earth and reduce the highlight areas inside my previous layer. I place these highlights the same way next to the cracks as in the previous steps. I'm just covering less of the surface of the flat earth layer. On the reflection, I do the same, reducing my highlights towards the black line of the reflections that could mirror the ground. You need about the same ratios of colors as you have it on the base as on the reflections. So if you make this layer too big, it would look a bit weird since the mid-tone of the base is the flat brown color and not this one that is mixed with the ice yellow. It will feel like the chrome is reflecting a different environment, so curb your highlights if you need to.
When the wind outside is howling and the rain taps on the panes, Papa's hands keep up their chordal block, whose sail prevails in the home where laughter mingles, every night tells fairy tales. Papa Lebert's tiny tapping, every heart it sure impales.
I go back to the OSL effect and make it more intense towards the lower side of the base. The light is coming from below, so we need to catch the raised parts of the rocks in a way that makes this effect work. Add more volume to the bottom of the rocks and a little bit less on the sides. examine each rock which is facing towards the ground and which are not, so your OSL effect will look more consistent. Same goes for the reflections on the right side of the torso. With baharroth blue, I paint the maximum value highlights on the OSL starting from the bottom and applying less and less towards the top of the rock column. I did apply some on the bicep, but later I realized it doesn't really make sense because, as I said, these reflections needs to reflect the same ratios what the surface they are reflecting has. And the caledor sky blue is more dominant than these highlights. Also, it works with a very thin line, but just don't apply too much. I mix more ice yellow to the flat earth and paint the maximum highlights on the rocks and reflections. I use a little bit thinner consistency this time, but I remove the excess on a paper towel from my brush, so I have a good control over the paint. Emphasize more the cracks over the surface and use very thin lines on the reflections to keep the color ratios. The chrome effect needed some extra contrast, so I went back and painted the thin line with white gray directly next to the black line. This helps with the effect to stand out a bit more. To have some nice definition over the armor, I went back and painted some thin lines between the armor panels with French Mirage blue. I did this between the parts with the maximum highlights, and on the darker parts I used black. You can use black all the way to have a more high contrast feel to those recessed shadows, but these recesses are facing towards the sky and it doesn't make much sense that they are that dark next to the maximum value highlights. But that's just a choice of what you prefer. With that, Colossus is done and ready for the table. If you'd like to see your favorite heroes and villains receiving a video or a PDF guide, you can vote each month on my Patreon page and get access to some PDF guides for characters that won't receive a video guide. A huge thanks to my patrons who support these kinds of videos, with special shout out to Cold-Blooded Dom, Trying to Paint Minis, Jonathan Mosner, Glitchy McCrash, and Panoman45. I hope your day will be as smooth as a granny's butt cheek.
Papa Lambert's got a swing and a grin that's mighty grand. Every evening in the parlor, he'll slap on tiny hands. In the twilight, the sound lingers, just a rhythm on demand. Soft and simple, sweet as syrup, that's what makes Papa band. With a chuckle and a chuckle, every slap's a gentle tune. In the living room, he whispers all his secrets to the moon.